On August 20th, 1991, a 16-year-old boy left home for a party on a rural Indiana back road. By 3 in the morning, he was dead. The official report called it a tragic accident, a drunk teenager who passed out on the pavement and got hit by a car. But when his sister finally saw the photographs years later, she knew something was wrong. The injuries didn't match the story. The investigation had missed too much. And in a town of 500 people, the silence around what really happened that night has lasted over 30 years. Laurel, Indiana sits in Franklin County, a speck on the map with barely over 500 residents, the kind of place where the nearest stoplight is miles away, and everybody recognizes the cars driving past their windows. Jason Dale Bolton grew up there in the 1980s with his mother Margie Boyer and his sister Tommy, and while the family didn't have much money, living in what Tommy later called the rough part of town, they made do as best they could, though in a place that small, there weren't many parts to speak of. Jason was born April 15th, 1975 in Connorsville, and by 16, he was already working at a local stone quarry to help bring in money for the family. His teachers described him as a decent student, with no major problems at school, though he'd been caught smoking marijuana a couple of times, which was nothing particularly unusual for a teenage boy in rural Indiana during that era. The day before he died, Jason spent hours helping an elderly neighbor stack firewood and haul water, a selfless gesture that defined who he was. Tommy remembered her brother as someone who couldn't walk past a person who needed help without stopping to offer it. August 20th, 1991 was a Tuesday, and Jason left home that evening with some neighbors and possibly a cousin too, all of them heading to a party out where Fayette, Franklin, and Rush counties meet. These gatherings happened on back roads, where farmland stretched in every direction and you could drink beer without worrying about police cruising by. Jason brought along his friend Timothy Percival Jr., who everyone called Tiny, and the two of them drank through the evening. According to what Tiny would later tell police, the party was at a house where several people had gathered, with music and beer flowing, just the usual teenage gathering. But something happened that night that Tiny either didn't see or wouldn't talk about. Around 1 in the morning, according to what authorities would later report, Jason and Tiny decided to head out, with the plan supposedly being to walk to Jason's father's house on County Road 750 South. Already there was something off about this though, since Jason and his father had been separated for years, and some accounts say they'd never even met. Walking to a stranger's house at 1 in the morning didn't make much sense, and there was another problem with this story. The distance from where the party was held to where Jason's father lived was considerable, meaning that for two drunk teenagers on foot, it would have taken hours. Tiny's account to police was straightforward but raised questions that were never properly answered. He said they got tired while walking and decided to rest on the road, so they both lay down on the pavement and fell asleep. When Tiny woke up, he heard a vehicle approaching and rolled to the side of the road just in time, but unfortunately, Jason didn't wake up. Tiny said he saw the vehicle hit his friend, then panicked and ran all the way back toward town, eventually making it home sometime after 3 in the morning. But here's what doesn't add up. If Tiny was close enough to Jason to roll away from an oncoming vehicle, why didn't he try to wake Jason or shout a warning? And if he witnessed his best friend getting hit by a car, why didn't he immediately go for help instead of running home? These questions were never properly answered, and Tiny gave his statement, which, as far as the official investigation was concerned, was enough. At 3 that morning, a man named Dwayne A. Grimm was driving along County Road 750 South when his headlights picked up something on the pavement ahead. Grimm later told Trooper Todd Fields that he thought he saw a person in the road, so he swerved left to avoid them, but then his vehicle hit a second person he hadn't seen on the other side. That person was Jason. Grimm stopped his vehicle and got out to find something horrific on the road, then drove to the nearest house and called for help. When Trooper Fields arrived at the scene, Grimm repeated his story about seeing one person swerving to miss them and hitting another person he didn't see until it was too late. Fields examined the scene and took Grimm's statement, though there's no record of Grimm being tested for alcohol or drugs that night, and there's no record of his vehicle being thoroughly examined beyond a basic inspection. The investigation, from the very beginning, accepted Grimm's version of events as fact. Fayette County Coroner Joseph E. Todd came out to the scene and documented his findings in clinical medical language. The front left tire had struck Jason in the groin area with severe trauma and loss of tissue, and the body had been pushed down the road before the vehicle ran completely over it. crushing the left side rib cage and fracturing the skull in 2 places with massive internal injuries and internal hemorrhaging. But when you look at those injuries more carefully, there were questions about whether a tire running over someone would create this specific pattern of trauma. While the crushing injuries to the rib cage and skull make sense in that context, the groin injuries were different, and according to those who later examined the case, they were more consistent with intentional mutilation than with a vehicular accident. The tissue found on the roadside wasn't just damaged, but had been completely separated from the body in a way that raised serious concerns. Jason didn't have any identification on him, and his clothing was in disarray. There were other details in the scene photos that the family would point to years later. Things like the positioning of the body, the specific location and pattern of blood on the pavement, and the lack of skid marks from Grimm's vehicle that would normally appear if a driver had tried to brake or swerve suddenly. Tommy got a phone call around 3 or 3:30 that morning from her ex-husband, who told her that Jason was dead in the road and that his buddy Tiny had run off. Tommy's husband answered the phone while their 2 older boys were sleeping in bunk beds in the living room, and they woke up and heard the whole terrible conversation unfold. She started calling around frantically, trying to reach the sheriff's department, but there was confusion about which county this had even happened in, with questions about jurisdiction eating up precious time while she tried to get information about her baby brother. The next day, Tommy identified Jason's body at the hospital morgue, and years later, she would write about that moment in just 1 sentence. "My life stopped the night I identified baby Jason." Urban Funeral Home took Jason's body, and the death got ruled accidental, just a drunk teenager who passed out on the road and got hit by a car. The file went into a drawer, and Jason was buried at Laurel North Cemetery in Franklin County. The family accepted what they were told at first, that this was an accident, a horrible thing, but not a crime. The authorities suggested they didn't need an autopsy and asked why they would want to put the family through more pain when it was clearly an accident. Years passed before Tommy decided to use the Freedom of Information Act to get the documents about Jason's death. And when the papers arrived, there were photographs mixed in with the reports. Scene photos and morgue photos that would change everything. Tommy looked through them and started noticing things that didn't line up with the official story. The report mentioned the groin area being struck by a tire using clinical wording that sounded straightforward on paper, but the photographs showed something else entirely. The entire groin area was mutilated, and tissue was found on the side of the road, with the extent and nature of the damage not looking like what a tire would do, at least not to Tommy and not to others who would later look at the case. The toxicology came back showing Jason's blood alcohol was 0.116%, legally drunk, and there was also Xanax in his system at 19 nanograms per milliliter. But neither of those things explained the injuries Tommy was seeing in the photographs, the kind of injuries that suggested something far more sinister than a simple traffic accident. She started asking around Laurel, talking to people who'd been at that party or who'd heard things over the years, and information came slowly, with some of it arriving as anonymous letters to the family's mailbox. The first letter came several months after Jason's death with handwriting that was shaky, like someone who was scared even putting pen to paper, saying that Jason had tried to help a girl at the party who was being assaulted, that he'd gotten into a confrontation with several men, and that what happened next was meant to punish him for interfering. More letters followed over the years, some more detailed than others, with one mentioning specific names of people who'd been at the party, though those names have never been publicly released by the family, while another letter described the layout of the house where the party was held, with details that matched what the family had learned independently. The letters were consistent in their core claim. Jason hadn't died in an accident, but had been deliberately killed, and his body had been placed on that road to make it look like he'd been hit by a car. The family took these letters to law enforcement and were told that anonymous tips were unreliable, that without witnesses willing to come forward and make official statements, there was nothing to investigate. The letters couldn't be verified or used as evidence since they were just paper, just words, just allegations. But to Tommy, there were pieces of a puzzle that was starting to come together, describing things that matched what she was seeing in the photographs while explaining the injuries that didn't make sense and giving a reason for the inadequate investigation. And they named people who, as the years went on, would find themselves in legal trouble for other violent crimes. Rumors had been floating around Laurel for months after Jason died, and in a town of 500 where gossip travels faster than official information, different versions of the story made their way through the community. Some people said Jason had seen something at the party he wasn't supposed to see, while others mentioned he'd tried to stop several men from attacking a girl, that he'd stepped in when he should have kept walking. The account that reached the family went like this. 4 men grabbed Jason at some point during the night, and there were witnesses, people who saw what happened but were too scared to speak up. These 4 men restrained Jason and castrated him, and the family believes he was still conscious when they did it. The reasoning behind this brutality, according to what the family has pieced together, was punishment, since Jason had seen something or tried to stop something, and this was retribution. In certain criminal circles, particularly in rural areas where intimidation maintains power structures, this kind of violence serves as a message, not just to the victim, but to everyone who witnesses it. Don't interfere, don't talk, and don't challenge us. A house full of people, and according to this version, nobody called for help, and nobody intervened, with the fear of what would happen to anyone who tried to stop it apparently being stronger than the horror of what was being done to a 16-year-old boy. After Jason passed out from blood loss, the men needed to hide what they'd done and couldn't just leave his body at the house since there were too many witnesses and too much evidence. So they carried him to County Road 750 South, choosing the location deliberately because it was rural enough that there wouldn't be much traffic, but public enough that a body found there wouldn't necessarily raise questions about where he died. They laid him on the pavement with his legs positioned a certain way, then drove a vehicle over him, specifically over his groin and chest, with the goal being to make the existing injuries look like they'd been caused by the vehicle, and to crush the rib cage, fracture the skull, and make it all look like a terrible accident. And it almost worked, since if the family hadn't pushed for those documents years later, if Tommy hadn't seen those photographs and recognized that something was wrong, it might have stayed buried forever. Brian Keith O'Hara, a private investigator who later looked into Jason's case, wrote about how the screaming during something like that would have carried through the house and beyond. That kind of pain doesn't stay quiet. When Tommy started digging into all of this, she naturally wondered why the police hadn't found any of it back in 1991, and part of the answer seemed to involve who was at that party. One of the people there was suspected of dealing drugs locally, but more than that, this person had family connections to the sheriff. In Laurel, the law enforcement presence consists of a handful of officers where most people are related by blood or marriage or go back multiple generations together, which means investigating someone connected to your own department gets complicated fast. Nobody tested the vehicles belonging to people who'd been at the party, and no one checked tires for blood, while police took statements from 4 individuals who'd been there, and those 4 told a story about 2 drunk boys on a road and a driver who couldn't see them in time. That became the official version that went into the files. Several of the people at that party had criminal records that would grow longer over the following years with charges involving drugs, assault, and sexual offenses. Some of them had been in trouble even before Jason died, though they'd generally avoided serious consequences up to that point. Tommy thinks law enforcement may have wanted to spare the family from hearing the graphic details about Jason's injuries, and she can understand that impulse. But she also believes a proper investigation requires telling the family the truth, especially when the injuries suggest foul play from the start rather than a simple accident. Jason's body was found on County Road 750 South, about 1,540 feet from County Road 575 West, a quiet stretch where traffic was light, especially at 3 in the morning when most people in rural Indiana are asleep. The family learned that this same area had seen another unsolved death in the early 80s when, around 1983, a man named Mark Aarons was found shot 3 times in the head on a road near Laurel. That case never got solved either, and when Tommy started making noise about Jason's death, it apparently drew attention back to some of these older cases that had been gathering dust in file cabinets for years. There's something else that bothers Tommy about Jason's burial, since she believes evidence got buried with him. His boots were placed in a bag in the coffin, and word went around town that a weapon might have been slipped in there too, though no one has ever confirmed this. She's been pushing for an exhumation, thinking modern forensics could analyze things that got overlooked or deliberately ignored back in 1991. When Tommy looks at those morgue photographs now, she sees her brother trying to tell her something about what really happened that night. Getting anyone in authority to pay attention has been another matter entirely. Laurel has 500 people, and if what the family heard is accurate, multiple witnesses saw what happened to Jason, watched it happen, didn't report it, and have kept quiet ever since. That kind of silence takes effort, since it's a choice made over and over, year after year, and maybe the fear runs deep. Speaking up against the wrong people in a place that small could cost you your job, turn your neighbors into enemies, or bring retaliation, and in tight-knit rural communities. especially ones where certain families have held power for generations. Breaking ranks can mean becoming an outcast or worse. There's also the passage of time to consider. Since the longer someone stays silent about something like this, the harder it becomes to come forward. If you witnessed a murder at 17 and said nothing, coming forward at 47 means admitting you've been lying for 30 years. Potentially facing charges for obstruction of justice or being an accessory after the fact, and having your own family and friends learn that you watched a teenager die and never told anyone. But the silence also means that if 4 men really did torture and kill a 16-year-old, they've lived their whole adult lives without consequences, walking around the same town and seeing Jason's family at the grocery store, building records that suggest violence wasn't a one-time thing for them. Tomi has made public appeals asking anyone with information to come forward, trying to make clear she's not looking to punish the police for mistakes they made in 1991. She understands that rural law enforcement in the early 90s didn't have the resources or training that exists today, and she's not trying to destroy anyone's career or reputation, but simply wants to know what actually happened to her brother and get at the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. The Indiana State Police have the case in their records, but without fresh evidence or witnesses willing to talk, there isn't much they can do with it. Cold case investigations require manpower, funding, and new leads. And a 3-decade-old case with no witnesses coming forward and no new physical evidence isn't going to get priority over active investigations. The file sits somewhere collecting dust, and Tomi's been told they don't have the funding or manpower to dedicate to Jason's death. So despite everything she's found and all the inconsistencies she's uncovered, Jason's death remains classified as accidental. Margie Boyer, Jason's mother, spent years trying to get attention on what she believed was a covered-up murder, but she didn't have resources or connections to powerful people. Just a mother from a poor family in rural Indiana, going up against a system that didn't want to reopen old files. The family created websites and started petitions while reaching out to media outlets and connecting with organizations that help families of unsolved homicide victims. They shared Jason's story on social media, hoping someone with information would see it and finally speak up about what they knew or witnessed. In 2010, a petition was launched asking Indiana authorities to properly investigate Jason's death, laying out what the family believed had happened, and gathering signatures from people around the country who read about the case and felt disturbed by how it had been handled. They've looked into legal options for forcing an exhumation, and in Indiana, you can potentially go through probate court with enough evidence in a process that wouldn't need permission from local law enforcement or the coroner. But exhumation costs money for opening the grave, performing a new autopsy, reburial, and legal fees to get the necessary court orders, so the family has tried raising funds for it, while hoping modern forensic analysis could find something that got missed or deliberately overlooked 3 decades ago. The 1991 autopsy was conducted by the county coroner, who was working with the assumption that this was an accident. So a modern forensic pathologist examining the same remains without that assumption might reach very different conclusions about what actually caused Jason's death. The family has also considered bringing in independent forensic experts to review the existing photographs and reports, which would be less expensive than exhumation and could potentially build a stronger case for reopening the investigation. Several forensic consultants have looked at the materials informally over the years, and their opinions have consistently aligned with the family's concerns, with the experts saying the injuries raised serious questions that weren't adequately addressed in 1991. But opinions from consultants, however expert they might be, don't carry the same weight as an official investigation. What the family really needs is for law enforcement to take another look, to bring in their own forensic specialists, and to re-interview witnesses with the knowledge that this might not have been an accident after all. For Tomi and her family, the past 30 years haven't brought healing, but have instead brought questions that multiply instead of diminish, with every new piece of information raising 10 more questions. Every person they talk to in Laurel either claims to know nothing or hints that they know more than they're willing to say, keeping their secrets close. Margie Boyer, Jason's mother, spent the last years of her life trying to get answers about what happened to her son, but she never got them and died without ever knowing the truth, carrying that weight until the end. Tomi has said she won't let it go and can't let it go, not while there's still a possibility that someone out there knows what happened and could come forward with information. The case has affected how Tomi views the world and how she understands justice, community, and truth. She's learned that in small towns, loyalty often matters more than law. That some crimes go unpunished, not because they can't be solved, but because the people with the power to solve them choose not to. and that silence can be as violent as the act it conceals. For the community of Laurel, Jason's death is a wound that never properly healed, with some people there believing the official story and thinking the family is chasing shadows while seeing conspiracy where there was only tragedy. Others know differently, but won't say so out loud, and still others have convinced themselves over the years that whatever happened, it's in the past and should stay there. But for a family seeking truth, the past isn't past, since it's present every day in the empty chair at holiday dinners, in the photographs of a boy who never got to grow up, and in the knowledge that someone out there knows what happened and chooses to stay silent. Tommy Bolton Schmidt still pushes for someone in authority to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, and to consider that the initial investigation got it wrong. She's not asking for speculation or assumptions, but for a proper forensic review, for witness interviews conducted with the understanding that this might be a homicide, and for the kind of investigation that Jason would have received if he'd been found with those injuries anywhere other than a rural road in a town of 500 people. She talks about Jason as someone who would help anyone, and who couldn't stand watching others get hurt, so if the rumors about that night are true, and he really did try to stop an assault, then he died trying to do the right thing because he had the courage to step in when everyone else looked away. The people who might know what happened are still out there, 30 years older now, but still carrying the knowledge of that night. Maybe they were at the party and saw everything, or maybe they only heard about it later, but know enough to corroborate the family's account. Maybe they participated and have lived with that guilt for 3 decades, or maybe they just stayed quiet out of fear and have wondered ever since if they made the right choice. That decision gets made fresh every day. Keep quiet, protect whoever was responsible, and let the family suffer without knowing, or pick up a phone and talk. Tell the truth even if it's 30 years late. Give Tommy the answers her mother died waiting for, and give Jason the justice he deserves. The number for the Indiana State Police is 765-778-2121, and they're waiting for that call just like Jason's family is still waiting after all these years. Jason's buried at Laurel North Cemetery in Franklin County, born April 15th, 1975, and died August 21st, 1991, at just 16 years old. His headstone sits in a quiet corner of the cemetery as a permanent marker for a temporary life, and his family visits when they can, bringing flowers and talking to him about what they're still trying to do for him. They think he deserves better than a file in a drawer marked accidental death, and believe he deserves an investigation that asks the hard questions and doesn't stop until it finds answers. They think the truth matters, even 30 years later, and somewhere in Laurel, Indiana, someone probably agrees with them. Someone who was there that night, or who knows what really happened. Someone who's kept quiet for 3 decades but might finally be ready to talk. The question is whether that person will find the courage before it's too late, before everyone involved is dead and the truth dies with them, before Jason's case goes from a cold case to an impossible one. If you know anything about what happened to Jason Dale Bolton on August 20th, 1991, the family will be thrilled to hear from you.